the hard part about tonight is going to be telling you everything that I want to tell you in the allotted time period, because I could talk to you for like 3 days about this. I tried to break it down into a couple of stories within each of these points here. What are fungi? And the history and evolution of fungi. It's actually a very intriguing story. The different life strategies of fungi, which comes into play if you want to start upping your game with mushroom hunting. You kind of need to understand the different types of life strategies. The role in the forest ecosystem, and then I'm a wildlife person. I study birds, so of course I've got to explain the really fascinating interconnections between fungi and wildlife. We'll tell you a couple of stories there. Thank you. And then, of course, how humans use fungi. And at the end, some resources for mushroom hunters. So I'm hoping to get through all of this. Just to ask, what is a fungus? And if it were a smaller group, I might call on people. But for the sake of time, we're going to start with the fancy words, and then we'll just get into something that's a little bit more relatable. So fungi, they're multicellular structures, and they're distinguished from other kingdoms. So they're in their own kingdom. They used to be in the plant kingdom, but they were somewhat recently put into their own kingdom because they differ in their strategies for nutrition, structure, growth, and reproduction. They don't make their own food. They actually secrete enzymes and acids to decompose complex molecules, which is very similar to humans. So it's kind of interesting that they're somewhat closely related to humans, even though they were in the plant kingdom prior. We're still figuring it all out. But on the left is just, a fruiting body, right? So when we walk out into the woods, we see any kind of mushroom popping up from the ground or off of a tree. It's a fruiting body. So that is called a mushroom. But the actual fungus, the organism, is the entire under the soil or in the tree network of filaments, as well as that fruiting body. Some people use the analogy of an apple on an apple tree. So the apple would be the fruiting body, and then the tree and root system would be the fungi. But yeah, so the body of the fungus is called mycelium. Who's heard of that word, mycelium? Yeah, it's quite a common word nowadays. 10 years ago, I bet we all wouldn't have raised our hands. So the individual branches of mycelium are called hyphae. You might hear that word. A massive hyphae is mycelium. So just in case you read a field guide and it talks about hyphae or something like that, it's really just the individual strands or filaments. On the right is just a microscope image of what hyphae look like. And each one of those segments are cells. The cell walls contain chitin. Can anybody shout out what else has chitin in it? Yeah, exoskeletons. That was a lot of exoskeletons. And up until somewhat recently, it's been debated on whether or not humans can digest chitin. It turns out we actually have chitin in our bodies too, and we likely can digest it, but that's a whole nother rabbit hole that we're not going to get into. But it is actually, if you're interested in diving deeper, there's some cool papers on it, and I can link those to you. So yeah, just some fun photos of what the mycelium look like. You can actually sometimes just dig into the soil around a tree and see the networks of the white or the yellow mycelium, which are just masses of hyphae. The reproductive structures are the fruiting bodies, and they reproduce by spores. Spores can be either asexual or sexual. This is an incredibly complicated process, and this is all I'm going to say about it, because it's just, if you look into textbooks on mycology, it is shockingly complex. And it varies by species. So yeah, just knowing that spores are the reproductive mechanism. And the other thing that I wanted to mention about spores is that knowing what the spores look like, what color they are, what shape they are, is integral for species identification. So there are some species that look very similar, and you can either do a spore print or look under a microscope. You can get a cheap microscope and do this, and it's very fun and addicting. More to you now. But a spore print would basically just be forcing the mushroom to drop its spores by cutting the top off, putting on a piece of paper and putting a piece of Tupperware over it, and just waiting 12 hours. And then you see if it either has white spores, green spores, brown spores. Has anybody done a spore print? Yeah, it's pretty fun. And if you have kids or if you're a teacher, this is actually a really great activity to explain what a spore is and why it's important for fungal reproduction. But some of them look wild. There's actually a mushroom that has penguin-shaped spores. No joke, penguin-shaped spores. Diving into the evolution of fungi. Might seem boring, but it's really not. So we have concrete evidence of mycelium dating back to, so mycelium, no fruiting bodies, right? Dating back to 715 to 810 million years ago. This article shows photos of those mycelial structures. This was found in fossilized remains of mycelium discovered in rocks in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And they found, these were microscopic fungi or mycelium, and they found them in the transitional zone between land and water. And it has implications that fungi in whatever form it was then was really important for the transition of plants from algae in the water to land, which is a big deal. So a recent discovery of a seafloor rock fossil indicates fungi may have been around as early as 2.4 billion years ago. And just for context, current life estimates that life originated on Earth 3.4 billion years ago. So here's those structures, and maybe we can, I don't know if people want to nerd out on these articles, we can send links out if folks want that. They're kind of dry, but the photos are good. Lichen, which is, you know, the leafy stuff that grows on trees, the usnea, the bearded lichen that we see all over the place, is thought to have appeared around 550 to 635 million years ago, though it could be much older. So this is actually a really interesting story. Lichen has evolved at least 4 separate times in 4 separate instances. And the relationship is between algae or cyanobacteria and fungi, and it most likely made it possible for plants to make the jump to live on land. And so how, you might ask? Well, lichen creates soil. Did anybody know that? Pretty cool. Yeah, lichen creates soil by breaking down rock. They'll do this with acids, primarily oxalic acid, and they grow in, their filaments get down into rock cracks, and it basically expands until the rock bursts open. And over millions of years, this is how just like a rock field turns into lush soil. So we have lichens, we have soil, plants are moving on to land, but how are plants going to access the nutrients in the soil? Anybody? Fungi. Yeah, so fungi is needed for those plants to uptake nutrients in the soil, and we're going to get into that in a moment. But the first mycorrhizal fungi appeared about 480 million years ago. So now we'll get into that. That sets the scene. The types of fungi, the different life strategies. So there are 5 right now. This is a new field of study. It's changing all the time. This might be different in 10 years. But for now, we have 5. Mycorrhizal, saprophytic, parasitic, endophytic, and lichen. And since we just talked about the mycorrhizal system, we'll start with that one. So yeah, mycorrhizal fungi, basically, they form symbiotic relationships with plants through a connection in their root systems to the mycelial hyphae. The fungus gets carbon, plants get fungal acquired nutrients and water. Fungi are able to absorb and transfer all 15 major macro and micronutrients necessary for plant growth. So it's kind of, to me, obvious that it evolved over a long period of time, right? So the fungi actually, so there's a lot of nutrients in the soil, macro and micronutrients, that are in forms that are not accessible to plants. They're not usable by plants, but the fungi actually excretes chemicals into the soil, dissolves those compounds, and makes the nutrients into an accessible form for plants, and then funnels it to the plant roots. So this 90 to 95% of plants can form mycorrhizal associations, but surprisingly, the region that has the least amount of mycorrhizal associations is the tropics. But when you think about it, though, it kind of makes sense because of the high decay rates. There's actually a lot of available nutrients in the soil. And so they don't necessarily need help in acquiring those nutrients. So because I'm a forester with OSU Extension, of course, I've got to link it back to forestry somehow. And it turns out that mycorrhizal fungi are incredibly important for growing timber in our area. These two trees shown here, the one on the right was inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi. The one on the left was not. This is an experiment, so it would have been in a nursery setting. Mycorrhizal fungi increase the absorption area and capacity of tree roots 10 to 1,000 times. And so it greatly improves the ability of the tree to grow and maintain vigor through drought or other stressful circumstances. And if you're a timber farmer and you are wondering if you have mycorrhizal fungi, you definitely do. That's how your trees are growing. Inoculation of mycorrhizal fungi during the nursery planting stage of timber production is pretty crucial. So outplanting your tree seedlings before you dig them up and sell them to people actually helps inoculate them with your native fungi instead of like buying mycorrhizal fungi from somewhere else and inoculating it and then it just dies in the field. But anyway, so it's an important process for reforestation in Oregon. So this is a cross-section of a plant root and two different ways that mycorrhizal fungi connects with plant roots. On the left, you have endomycorrhizae, and that, as you can see, the red filaments are the hyphae of the fungi, and they actually go into the cell walls of the plant, which is kind of wild. On the right, we have ectomycorrhizae. They form like a blanket almost on the plant root, and they do enter into the root, but in between the spaces in between the cell walls, and that's I believe it's the more common form of mycorrhizal fungi because it actually forms a mantle that protects, it's a physical barrier against root disease. So it actually, to some extent, helps protect tree and plant roots from root disease. They actually also excrete antibiotics. Certain species of fungi excrete antibiotics, which can actively fight off pathogens are trying to attack the root of trees. We have a lot of root rot in Oregon because it's so wet here. So this is a mechanism that helps to fight that off. But the fact that they're excreting antibiotics is a hint at the medicinal properties for humans later on. So mycorrhizal fungi has made the news quite a bit in the past 5-10 years. And I'm curious who's heard of the Wood Wide Web? Okay, a few people. So basically, there are a lot of, I feel like it's my need to just say this real quick to every group I talk to. There are a lot of extraordinary claims about what mycorrhizal fungi can do. And not all of it is founded in science. And it's kind of become a snowball effect where even scientists and journalists have gotten caught up in it. And so what we do know is what I basically just told you. Fungi do grow inside and on tree roots, forming a symbiosis, and they are essential for the growth of trees, and they do grant access to nutrients trees would not otherwise have access to. However, I'll give you an example. There are claims that seedlings benefit from being connected to mature trees, but we just don't know. There's no actual science to there is science. There are science saying both directions, that it does and that it doesn't. So I just wanted to offer that be keen in your studies and, pay attention to what folks are saying. If you really want to get wrapped up in the world of fungi, you'll quickly start hearing these narratives from both sides, and it's actually kind of interesting to follow the rebuttal papers back and forth. But so saprophytes are wood decay fungi. They get their nourishment from breaking down organic matter. and they basically just make stuff decompose. Without saprophytes, we would be living in a world of rotting, decaying material. We would just be drowning in decaying material. They're the beginning and the end of the food web, and they're great recyclers, and they turn death and decay into food and life. And they are everywhere, and they're very common. There's some on the back table, and without them, again, we'd just be overrun with rotting material. So I'm just going to mention the two major groups of saprophytes because some of them are edible and we've seen a lot of. So we have got white rot and brown rot. There are other kinds, but those are the two major groups in Oregon. White rot is actually really aggressive and sometimes can be parasitic. Does anybody know the mushroom that's pictured on the bottom right here? You can shout it out. Yeah, armillaria or honey fungus. I got both the common and the Latin names. That's perfect. So yeah, honey fungus is a major killer of trees in Oregon, and it's also a delicious edible for some people. So kind of an interesting, when I started learning forestry as somebody who's into mushrooms already, I started learning that not everybody loves honey fungus. The white mycelial fans in that tree up there is a telltale sign of a honey fungus infection. Butt rot is another one, but they're more on the aggressive side as saprophytes that border on parasites, actually. So the one on the bottom is the fruiting body, and the one on the top is the mycelium growing up through the tree. And they're white fans of mycelium, and they're super aggressive, and you can tell because they're growing up through a tree. You know, they're overwhelming that tree's response to pathogens. So yeah, like I said, when I started learning forestry, I started realizing that there are all these different names for these edible mushrooms that I know and love. So on the right, so that is red-belted conch. It's Fomitopsis. It's very common in Oregon, and it has medicinal properties. And then what about this bright orange one to the left of that? Chicken. I heard chicken of the woods in the back. Chicken of the woods. So it's a delicious edible for a lot of people. But in the world of forestry, it's called dark brown cubicle rot. So people in the woods were talking about dark brown cubicle rot, and I had no idea when we came up on it. I'm like, oh, chicken in the woods. Okay. But yeah, so these are less aggressive, and they just break down logs and return nutrients to the soil. It's funny, context in different worlds have so many different names for the same thing. So parasitic, we will not spend that much time on because really there's a lot of overlap with saprophytes. Essentially, the difference is if it's on a live or a dead tree. A lot of the same fungi species will attack both live and dead trees, and if it's a live tree, it's a parasite. If it's a dead tree, it's a saprophyte, and they'll kind of waffle back and forth. But there is a Phaeolus schwanitzi on the back table, and your executive director brought it. And that one is the picture there. It's called the Dyer's polypore. It creates every color in the rainbow, depending on what chemicals you add to it when you're dyeing fabric. It's very awesome. There's a picture of all the colors you can create in one of the books back there I can show y'all after. And honey mushrooms, cauliflower fungus is one of my favorite edibles. You know, again, nature does not abide by rules. It's not black and white. So a lot of this parasitic versus saprobic thing, it goes back and forth, and we're all still trying to figure it out. This is called a lobster mushroom, and this is an example of fungus on fungus parasitism. On the picture on the left there, the right mushroom is, I'm sorry in the back if you can't see that too closely, but it's just like your everyday white gilled mushroom, you know, like what you would draw a picture of. It's called Russula brevipes. And on the left is what happens to Russula brevipes after it's been infected by a fungal mold called Hypomyces lactiflorum. And so I took pictures. It looks so much nicer on the computer, so maybe after we can show you if you want to see, but of the transitional stages from start to finish. And so at the top, you see just your everyday white-gilled mushroom, and then there's a little bit of orange starting to form, more orange, and then it turns into a lobster claw-looking structure. And what's really interesting about this is if you DNA sequence the orange lobster mushroom, little to no DNA of the Russula brevipes exists anymore. So it is literally altering its DNA. And so one of the ways that it's doing this is altering the metabolites. Metabolites are responsible for the way a mushroom tastes and if it's edible to us. So while the starting mushroom, the Russula breviipes, is edible, it's really not that tasty. It's just kind of boring. It becomes absolutely delicious after this DNA alteration. It's really wild. And there is a lobster mushroom on the back table if you want to look at it. But yeah, if you can see on the right here, full gills on the top. The gills are starting to get warped there on the middle, and then no gills whatsoever on the bottom. So these are very abundant in Oregon and out in forests. So if you go out in the woods, you're likely to see one of these. Okay, endophytic is one that I don't fully understand because it's a kind of it's really complicated, but it's important to mention that there is a very large group of fungal species that live within plant tissues, like in the leaves, in the bark, and they're sometimes even in the cells, and they are integral to the survival of trees. We're learning more about them every day. There's over 1 million strains of known endophytic fungi, and we're just starting to learn about them. But they're almost like responsible. It's a symbiosis to the next level. So, but I don't know that much about it because it's beyond my scope. So I just wanted to mention that, and we'll go back to lichen. Lichen. So as I said earlier, it's a hybrid colony of algae or cyanobacteria living symbiotically among filaments of fungal species. So if you see in the photo on the right, that green ball is either algae or cyanobacteria, and it's harvesting light from the sun. Because remember, fungi can't create, they're heterotrophic, they can't create their own food, sugars. So this green, it's a nice looking ball in this photo. I don't know that it's always that case, but it harvests light from the sun, and the fungal filaments protect it from pathogens and give it a space to live in. We just somewhat recently found out that there's another player, and that says yeast. So there were experiments where there were two, what we thought were the same species of lichen. One was getting infected by a pathogen, one was not, and we now realize that yeast is an important part of this multi-species organism because it actually helps fight off pathogens. So it's, as you learn more, there's more questions and it gets more and more complex. But lichens, remember, they were one of the first things that existed on our planet. And so it's not surprising that they're extremophiles. They can live in extremely hot or extremely cold temperatures. They can survive in radiation, under high pressure at the bottom of the ocean, in volcanoes. They're just truly amazing. And they also create soil. Fungal role in the forest. I had this as a bullet point, but to what we're going to cover today, but we really just covered it all through talking about the life strategies of fungi, right? So they form mutualisms with trees, whether it be mycorrhizal or endophytic. They're largely responsible or a major player in forest health. Nutrient recycling. Saprophytes break down our dead wood and create or transform nutrients into a form that is usable by plants, able to be uptaken by plants. Pathogens, we talked about some of those parasites and white rots and brown rots. They sometimes kill trees, usually stressed trees. They'll usually go after stressed trees, or they can overcome stressed trees is how I should say that. But that creates wildlife habitat. There are a lot of birds and rodents that live in standing dead trees, otherwise known as snags. There are a lot of amphibians and reptiles that use down dead wood. Insects use down dead wood. So some level of dead trees is very necessary in our forests for a healthy forest. And then for succession, which is essentially just how the forest grows over time, wildlife also just eat fungi. And we'll get into that in a moment here. And then reforestation I mentioned earlier. And again, I think I already talked about this, but just to reiterate, they're integral in our timber industry here. We inoculate our seedlings that are outplanted through outplanting the seedlings into the ground before they're sold, but also inoculating them with mycorrhizal fungi. Another interesting thing about reforestation with fungi is wildfire. So there are lots of studies that show major shifts in fungal communities before and after wildfire. Before, in a healthy mature forest, it'll be dominated by mycorrhizal fungi. After a wildfire, it's going to be dominated by saprobic or wood decay fungi because A, a lot of live trees are gone, and B, there's a lot of down wood on the ground. So we really need those saprobic, those wood decay fungi to get in there and decompose all that down wood and return those nutrients back to the soil. In a lot of cases, the soil has been volatilized of nutrients, and so they're actively making that space usable for the next generation of seedlings. And then the second part of that is refugia of live trees that allow mycorrhizal fungi to grow back in once the saprobic fungi have done their thing. So I don't know if that all makes sense, but after wildfire, we need those wood decay fungi to come in and break everything down, and then it takes time for the mycorrhizal root filaments to come in from neighboring live trees, and it just works. Some species of fungi have like thousands of sexes, and so in order for it to successfully grow into a new area, spores are difficult because it would need to match exactly with a spore that is the right sex type, and so usually it happens through mycorrhizal growth because that's such a rare instance. But yeah, so we're going to just mention how wildlife use fungi as habitat, and then how wildlife use fungi as food. They also use it there's protection and pathogens, but we just don't have the time to go into that today. And there's not as many pretty pictures surrounding those topics. So fungi creates wildlife habitat. We talked about that a bit before. Some level of tree death is necessary in our ecosystem. But also, so on the left here, we have a red-breasted sapsucker, which is a primary cavity nester. And that basically means it's excavating the cavity, because not all species that use cavities are able to do that. And it can't, while some species of woodpeckers can excavate cavities in live trees, but a lot of them can't, and they require wood decay to get in there and soften the wood up to a certain degree so that they can excavate the cavity. So there's some cool research about how woodpeckers actually find trees at the right level of decay, and also that they are spreading fungal spores on their bellies and feet too, and inoculating future cavity starts. And I'm looking at Jose to make sure I'm saying this correctly. But yeah, so then the secondary cavity nesters come in. On the right is a female purple martin in the nest cavity there. So I was not studying fungi at all, but I was out there looking at snags that birds were in, and I couldn't help but notice, do you see that big conch, that big fungal body right on top of the nest? I'm like, that's really interesting. That, there's obviously a relationship here between fungal decay pathways and wildlife habitat, specifically cavity nesting birds. And yeah, so we'll go to this next slide here. Fungal decay pathways facilitate nest cavity excavation, essentially. And I do an entire other presentation on this topic. But this is just I stuck my phone in a nest cavity, and those are 6 baby purple martins stuffed in there. So the point of this is a segue to the next slide, because when a woodpecker, like a smaller down-ear hairy woodpecker, excavates a cavity, it's not necessarily large enough yet for a purple martin to use to cram all these 6 bird bodies in there. But there's a successional pathway of wood decay fungi within a snag too. And over time, those cavities get bigger and bigger as the wood decays more and more, up until a point where they're no longer usable because they're too soft to have any structural integrity. And so this is kind of a photo showing that. So on the top, it's an oak seedling. And so going through the whole life cycle of how fungi is involved here, they are the oak seedling is inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi. In this case, it is a black trumpet mushroom, which is my favorite mushroom, but which is why I picked this example. And then, the mycorrhizal fungi allow the tree to be vigorous and grow big and healthy and strong. But at some point, there are, in some cases, these aggressive parasitic wood decay fungi that can attack mature trees, like is happening here, and eventually kill it and make it accessible for other wood decay fungi. So there are only a few types of wood decay fungi that can attack a fully healthy mature tree and fight its resistance, or what am I trying to say? Yeah, its defenses, thank you. And then that kind of loosens everything up to the point where a less aggressive wood decay mushroom can come in, and then a less aggressive wood decay mushroom. And so this wildlife habitat and these cavity nesting species are tightly linked with fungal biology, fungal ecology, wood decay mushrooms, and it's just all very magical. And then, I just had to include more purple martin baby photos. I guess the point here is that one of the pathways is woodpeckers spreading spores around on their bellies, and another pathway is branch breakage that happened here, and other fungal species getting in. So there's two different pathways happening there. Yeah, so a little bit more about wildlife. Fungi as food for wildlife. So wildlife, a lot of them love eating mushrooms. And if you start getting into mushroom hunting, you'll notice very quickly that squirrels do not eat an entire mushroom. They take one bite out of every mushroom. Yeah, and so deer sometimes do the same thing, but usually they'll eat more of it. And bears just eat the whole thing, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. But this is a fun story to kind of just bring it all home here with wildlife and fungi. So we have northern flag squirrels here, and they love eating mushrooms, specifically what are hypogeous mushrooms, which are mushrooms that grow underground. And so a lot of people think of truffles as only edible, but there's actually hundreds of non-edible truffles, and squirrels love them. And they have evolved together, and they're very smelly to attract squirrels, is one theory, at least. So the digestive system of flying squirrels and lots of other rodents can actually, it digests the fruiting body of the mushroom and does not digest the spores. And so you could just imagine a northern flying squirrel flying from tree to tree, pooping out mushroom spores everywhere. And that's really good for the truffles, right? Because they grow underground. So how else are they going to reproduce? And so this is an example of a symbiotic relationship that evolved over probably millions of years, I don't know, that they work together where the rhizopogon, the truffle, gets its spores spread all around the forest, and the flying squirrel gets really tasty food. And then indirectly, flying squirrels nest in conifer trees, and rhizopogon, or lots of truffles, are mycorrhizal with conifer trees. So it's all just this really cool system. One more wildlife story. So actually, I'm going to start here. So I should have switched these, but I was at the beach one day a couple years ago, and I noticed these bear prints going into a lodgepole or a shore pine thicket, and I thought, I should follow these. Because I know that bears love mushrooms, and I was looking for a very specific kind of mushroom that I know bears love. And I was with a group of people, so it felt okay. So we followed these bear tracks into the shore pine forest and found the biggest matsutake flush I've ever found in my life. And so on the left, you can see, it's really hard to see up here, but there's the bears dig them out. And if you can see the claw marks digging them out, so it's very obvious that it's a bear, and bear poop around, but they dig the whole mushroom out and eat it. So if you didn't see those bear claw marks, you wouldn't have known it was a bear. Or you might have thought it was a person, actually. But yeah, then I guess after they didn't eat them all, or after they more fruited, so we found lots of matsutake that way. I'm not endorsing following bear tracks, into the forest. But it was a really fun kind of an experimental trip into the woods. There's our matsutake. Yeah, which is a prized mushroom around here that's just starting to fruit right now, in case anybody's interested. So I guess I just add on here that fungi is 76 to 83% digestible in bears. That's a lot more than humans. I don't remember exactly what it is in humans, but humans have a harder time digesting mushrooms unless they're really cooked down. And bears can eat them raw and digest up to 80%. So that's pretty incredible, and it makes sense why they're eating so many mushrooms. And then, yeah, this study is just an example of how bears in different ecosystems are now switching to eating more fungi because other protein sources are becoming more scarce. So bears in Yellowstone love eating white bark pine nuts, and white bark pine is not doing so great right now because of white bark pine blister rust. And so they're actually watching bears switch over to eating fungi as an alternative protein source in preparation for hibernation. So while they might have been more opportunistic in eating fungi in the past, they're actually now, it's becoming more of an important resource in certain ecosystems. Lichen is also a place for feeding for wildlife. Lots of birds feed on insects in lichen, but this one is one of my favorites. So golden eagles nest on rocky ledges, and their nestlings projectile poop out of the rock crevices onto the rocks, and they're very high in nitrogen. And there's a lichen that loves nitrogen and loves growing in golden eagle poop. And so this orange lichen on this rock wall makes it really easy for biologists to locate golden eagle nests. I just thought that's a really cool hack for studying golden eagles, is to just look for it's called Xanthoria is the lichen, but yeah, it's that orange stuff. All right, so we'll get into the human uses of fungi. There's really, the premise of this talk was supposed to be more of like a fungal ecology overview in the forest. So getting into human uses of fungi is a whole nother talk, but I couldn't not do it. So there's a lot of research going on right now using fungi for mycoremediation, textiles. On the bottom right, it's actually showing how somebody figured out how to make bread waste which has yeast, which is a fungi, into monofilaments for sustainable textiles. Like, that's wild. Other sustainable materials, building materials, not just clothing and textiles. Dye, like I mentioned, that polypore can create every color of the rainbow just with one mushroom. And then, of course, medicine. Mushrooms contain biologically active compounds that can fight degenerative diseases. And there's a lot of debate right now about using fruiting bodies or mycelium, but I was reading a lot about it just before this talk, actually, and found some really cool research on culturing specific mushroom strains to enrich the mycelium for therapeutically stronger mycelial medicine. So there's some cool stuff going on right now with fungal medicine. But yeah, not necessarily my place to talk about. It's also preventative medicine because it has just loads. I'm pretty sure most species of mushrooms have all amino acids that humans need. There's definitely a long list of them, but I don't want to say all mushrooms do, edible mushrooms. Lots of vitamins and minerals, and this is one of the only sources of consumable vitamin D that is usable by the body. And better yet, if you go mushroom picking, so see, there's this mushroom here, it has like a reddish brown cap. That's because it's out in the sun. It got a suntan just like we do, and it has bioaccumulated more vitamin D. So if you pick mushrooms and you lay them out in the sun when you get home, they will actually accumulate more vitamin D. Yeah, seaweed does this too, so you can do this on the beach as well. Yeah, but yeah, preventative medicine is sometimes food. So then, of course, I just threw the slides in now that of the common mushrooms we're going to find right now, and I think we've got some time to go through them. Yeah. So chanterelles, probably everybody knows about chanterelles. But one thing I don't know that a lot of folks realize is that we have 4 different species here, and they all fruit in different habitats. So when I first started mushroom hunting, I just kind of like hiked along and whatever I found. But now I realize if I want to get a rainbow chanterelle, I have to go to Sitka spruce forest. And so once you start learning those different connections, you can really level up your mushroom hunting game. All of the mushrooms, like I said, have lots of vitamins and nutrients and vitamin D. So I'm not really going to go through those, but I brought some golden chanterelles on the back table. They are super delicious and easy to cook, but they don't so if you're dehydrating mushrooms for storage, they don't rehydrate well, so I don't recommend that. So one thing that I do with all my odds and ends of mushrooms is dehydrate them and blend them into a powder in like a coffee grinder or something, and then use it as a mixed mushroom powder spice. This is an epic year for chanterelles. It hasn't been this good in a while. And so people are picking more than they can consume in a period of time. And so chanterelles is tricky because they don't dehydrate. Well, they dehydrate fine, but they don't rehydrate well. So mixed mushroom powder is one way. I don't know if folks want to share their other ways at the end, but I did want to show you the other 3 kinds. On the left here is a rainbow chanterelle that's Cantharellus roseocatus. They grow with spruce and 2-needle pines. And on the top right is a white chanterelle, which would be Cantharellus subalbidus, and they grow with old growth Doug fir and hemlock, whereas the golden chanterelle that we all are familiar with tend to like younger to middle-aged Doug fir. You certainly can find them in older growth Doug fir, but not in like the huge flushes. And then bottom right there is cascadensis, and that one was very similar in growth habit to the golden chanterelle. So porcini mushrooms, my favorite. There's a fall and a spring porcini mushroom. If you didn't know, now you know. I'm surprised I even told you that. But the one cool thing I wanted to talk about porcini mushrooms is all 4 of these on the right were found in the same area in one day. So there's just really wild variation in cap color, what I call chonk factor, which is just the thickness or the density of it. The reticulation, which is, I don't know if you can kind of see it down here. It's this braiding, this webbing that is over the site. Different depths of that, and then the microhabitat. And generally, the darker cap ones are in sunnier areas, but there's a lot more to it than that. But there's a lot of research going on right now with porcini because there's so many different looking ones, and folks my ecologists are like, these can't all be the same species. And so there's a lab at the University of Utah that specializes in studying porcini, which I think would be a cool job. But they found just so many different genetic lineages, and that it really has to do a lot with environmental factors, ecological factors, more than gene flow. So even though there's spores flying around everywhere, that you would expect hybridization to happen there, but it doesn't, because there's something else. There's a stronger force ecologically, which is just fascinating. But we're still learning about this. But there's a lot of questions when I take new mushroom hunters out, like, oh, is this a porcini? It doesn't look like the last one I picked, but it usually is, yeah. And then I just wanted to do, in the last few minutes, some online resources for if you want to go mushroom hunting, or if you just want to learn about fungi, see what's out there. There are different ways to look for specific species, or just, here, we'll just go through them. So this first map here is just a tree species map. So I mentioned earlier that different species of chanterelles fruit with different tree species, same with morels. There's 32 species of morels in the state. Did anybody know that? Yeah, crazy. So in each one of them, fruits in a different habitat type with different tree species. So this is a USDA Tree Explorer map, very high level, very broad scale. But if you're looking for where Sitka spruce grow, this is a good starting point. Topographic maps are excellent, and this is the pro tip of the night. You want to find the areas that are flattest. And not just because it's easy. And the way that you do that is the lines on the topographic map, when they're really close together, that's a steep area. When they're far apart, it's not, it's more flat. And for some reason, well, we think it's because of disturbance. So, okay, let me back up. Porcini and chanterelles like fruiting in flat areas, but specifically porcini, and they're disturbance-loving mushrooms. So if you think about the Cascade Mountains in the spring or the fall with storms bringing, like when snow's melting, bringing all this debris down, it all ends up in these flat areas. So there's like big nutrient influx and lots of disturbance and lots of porcini mushrooms and chanterelles. So that's the pro tip of the night. Write that one down. If you're looking for morels specifically, you're going to either need to know your tree species for non-burn morels, but if you want to go after the burn morels, you got to know where the burns are. And so a lot of times now, because of safety reasons, they're not opening burns up after burns, which makes sense. So you got to make sure that you read the regulations on that. But again, this is not supposed to be a how to go mushroom hunting talk, but I just wanted to give you some resources to get started on. Something so you don't get lost. I use Onyx. Gaia is another example. There are other apps out there. It tracks your path without using Wi-Fi. It's using your phone GPS if you upload where you're going to be beforehand. So that's an important step. But it tracks your path like you see on the right here. And so you can just walk back on the same path. It's very handy, and it's saved me quite a few times. And you can also put pins on where you are. But it also, a lot of these apps now show land ownership. And land ownership is very important. You need to know where you're at. There are different regulations on different public lands, and certainly private land, you don't want to just wander into that. iNaturalist is the best. Everybody should use it. It's good for a couple of reasons. So one, just like there's all these photo apps where you take a picture of something and it tells you what it is. I genuinely think iNaturalist is the best. Seek is also offered by iNaturalist. They're using experts along with AI. So like the leading mycologists are on there. Alan Rockefeller, who is the world's leading mycologist, is on there every morning, like as he drinks his coffee, correcting things. And so that makes me feel really good about using this as a resource. Of course, it's a launching point to figure out what you're looking at. But for mushrooms, I think it's the most helpful. It's also helpful for identifying new spots, and I kind of jokingly put that you can see where other people are picking mushrooms, but the joke in that is that a lot of people don't post their porcini spots. But some people do. Some people are nice, and so you can go on there and get an idea. You can look at where people are seeing what you're looking for and replicate that habitat. Like, oh, what is the elevation? What time of year is it? What trees are growing here? And then that's how you can, I actually do that a lot to locate new spots. And here's the iNaturalist platform. You can just enter any species you want to find. I do this a lot for foraging too. Like if I want to find a magnolia tree and it's not, a native tree, I'll go and find it and knock on their door. But yeah. So one important thing, somebody brought this up to me at the beginning, needs to be said. There is a really horrible situation happening right now with artificial intelligence and mushroom identification books. Every week there is just a flow of fake foraging and mushroom ID books. A lot of them are on a major website that people buy a lot of things from. And this has been going on for over a year, maybe 2 years, but it just finally happened that just a couple weeks ago, an entire family was sent to the hospital because they bought this book thinking that it was trustworthy, and it was not. Totally fake, made up information, and they ate poisonous mushrooms. So ending this talk by making sure that you know that the author of your book is a real person. You can Google it. Doesn't take any time to just Google it and see if something else comes up, and it's not just some name with no mushroom-related response or hits on Google. I have lots of books on the back. These are 4 that I use a lot. My recommendation for this area are the 2 on the left by Michael Bugh, Mushrooms of Cascadia, and then Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast or Mushrooms of Cascades by Christian Schwartz and Noah Siegel. But again, just be really careful about your sources with mushrooms if you get into the edible side of things. But yeah, so that's all that I had. How do you determine if a mushroom is poisonous or not? So it seems like a somewhat easy question, but it's actually not, because there are a lot of mushrooms that were just listed as poisonous in field guides that are older field guides that we're now realizing that they are edible. So I would say joining a mycological society is a really great way to learn your mushrooms. They're all over the state. You'll make mushroom nerd friends. Using field guides in combination with, if you post on iNaturalist, you can get responses from expert mycologists to say, yes, that is actually what you see. But using a field guide is, base level. You want to go beyond that and do a little extra research. So I would say if you're a new mushroom hunter starting with easier species like lobster mushrooms and chanterelles, because there aren't lookalikes that are toxic, that's a good starting point. And avoiding things that have a lot of lookalikes, like there's whole families of mushrooms that there's one edible and the rest are toxic. Just avoid all of those. Don't even mess around with it. Yeah, so he's asking about on Starker lands or really any commercial or private timberlands, how sometimes folks can't replant with Doug fir because I mentioned that white rot, the saprobic fungi, root rots are very common here, and they are Douglas fir tree killers. And, if we're thinking about, so depending on what your objectives for managing the land are, if you're thinking about creating wildlife habitat, not a big deal. But if you're growing trees for money, it is a big deal. And so what happens is they cut all the Doug fir down in a sanitation cut, and then they'll plant something like western red cedar, which is, I don't know if immune is the right word, but they don't get infected by root rot. So the thought is maybe like 50 years that might be okay to replant Doug fir, but we don't actually know that. So yeah, it's going to be an issue forever in Oregon. It's a native species of root rot, but that's likely what they were talking about. Yeah, so the question is about the high severity wildfires and how that impacts the fungal response. And it's certainly, yes. So historically, it would be more of a there'd be patches of high severity amongst moderate and low severity. And so even though there was high severity that really killed all the microorganisms and fungal mycelium, there were these refugia areas that would reinoculate that somewhat rapidly, but now because it's larger swaths and the refugia forest is so much farther away, the idea is it's taking a lot longer. And I mean, we've seen it, how long it takes trees to regrow in some of these high severity burns. So yeah, I don't know. Yes, I would say so. I would say it's having a negative. Yeah, but honestly, in the end, the mycelium will make it there. It's just noticeably slower for those high severity burns now. Yeah, okay. So the question was, if you go to a store, you see soils that say they're infused with mycorrhizal fungi. I don't want to get in trouble with companies or anything, but I lean towards that being maybe not a scam, but maybe misguided, because mycorrhizal communities are incredibly site-specific and changing dynamically over time. So to pinpoint exactly what's needed in a bag at a store seems impossible to me. I would imagine what would happen is those mycorrhizal fungi would be outcompeted by native and die, and then you already have mycorrhizal fungi in your soil. But yeah, whether it's a scam or just misguided, I don't know. Well, no, okay, wait. Let me clarify. It's not necessarily false. We just there is not a robust enough network of published research that proves that. So it might be true, but there's research that shows this way and that way, and it's just kind of too soon to know, and I think that's all I'm going to say about that. Yeah.
That was one of those mind-blowing things.
I want to stress that when I was mentioning the World Wide Web thing, I'm not saying it's all not true. There was just a spiraling of excitement that led to some unfounded claims, which might be true, but they're just not based in science yet. She was asking about agricultural practices like tilling. There's been some talk of tilling not being great for our soil, and the reason for that is I don't know much about this topic, but from what I can remember, it's just that tilling destroys it degrades mycorrhizal communities. The other thing about agriculture is a lot of our crops they rely more on arbuscular and endophytic fungi as opposed to mycorrhizal fungi. So I don't know how that all connects, because I do know that tilling degrades mycorrhizal fungi, but if you're talking about endophytic fungi living in the plant leaves, I don't know. Yeah, when you're looking at a lichen, like if we think of like those leafy lichens, what you can see and touch are the fungal filaments. The reproductive structures were releasing spores. That's part of the fungi. You know, when lichen get those weird reproductive things on them. Yeah. The lichenized fungi thing. I actually have a lichenized fungi and lichen omphalina back there that I can show you. But when I mentioned lichen have evolved at least 4 times, what's actually happened there is it's flip-flop between lichen and fungi, just straight fungi, and then something happened in the environment that didn't work, so it went back to lichen, back to fungi, back to lichen. It's a very interesting story, and the lichenized fungi it kind of like throws everything out the window, because it's basically an algal, so it's like a rock covered in algal bloom with a fungi coming out of it, and that's the symbiosis. That's the lichen symbiosis. But it throws a wrench in everything. But I can show you one of those back there. Yeah. So herbicides directly wouldn't impact the mycelium because they're very specifically formulated to go after either like broadleaf trees or conifers or grasses or whatever. But indirectly, yes, because they're messing up the balance of the ecosystem, and a lot of times, well, yeah, it's kind of a complicated one, because if we're talking about invasive species and spraying herbicide on that, the invasive species were already degrading the fungal community, but the herbicide itself is not killing the mycelium on contact, but you're inevitably changing the environment, and therefore the fungal community will change. And whether that's in a beneficial way or a non-beneficial way is up to your perspective on what your objectives are. Yeah, I mean, the question is about invasive mushroom species, and that's kind of a new frontier. Have we heard of the death cap mushroom? That's technically an invasive species that's moving throughout the U.S. There's a lot of like tree pathogens that are invasive species, like white pine blister rust and the ribes fungus. But yeah, I'm sorry. What is the question here? I'm sorry, I just went off on. Oh, the oak wilt. I gotcha. Yeah. So that's an invasive fungal pathogen. Totally. Yeah. And Mediterranean oak borer is an insect that's carrying invasive fungus and farming it in our oak trees. So yeah, that is a worrisome issue, and because our trees have not developed, they have not evolved with these fungal pathogens, and so they have not developed the defense systems against them, and therefore they are able to kill even sometimes vigorous and healthy trees. So yeah, we're all trying to wait and see what happens there, I guess. I'm not directly involved with the oak wilt, but with Mediterranean oak borer and the fungal farming, we don't really have any answer for it at this time. Oh, yeah, because the yeast is a fungus, right? So yeast is a single-celled fungus. And so so yeast is a simple single-celled structure that is a part of the fungal kingdom, but when we think of lichen and the fungal filaments that create what we see, that's a complex multicellular fungus. But they both are technically fungi. Yeah. But yeast would be like the structure that holds the algae is the main fungus, and then yeast is like single-celled, kind of just spattered around all over the filament. No, different, because yeast species are all single-celled organisms, and they're living on top of the fungus that is a multi-celled organism. Yeah, all lichens are symbiotic with fungi. The makeup of, wait, let me rephrase that. Lichen is a symbiosis between fungi and either cyanobacteria or algae. So lichen is actually a multi-organism. The word lichen describes like 3 or 4 different organisms in a symbiotic relationship together. And the name of the lichen is the name of the fungal filament, because they had to decide how to name it. So they picked the fungi, since that's what we see in the structure. All right. Any last questions? Well, thanks, everybody.